Got three participants. Looks like three participants down there.
You can see three participants, Paul?
Yeah, that's what we have there.
5.
There we go. Now we're starting to log in. So we have about 5 participants signing in, and we're gonna kick off in just a minute or two as people.
Okay, great. So, all right, I will follow your lead. And earlier, Paul, you asked the name of the diocese I was working on a project with.
Right, yes.
The Diocese of Iowa. And the name of their project, their diocesan campaign, is Gilead, which stands for Growing Iowa Leaders, Engaging All Disciples.
Nice.
So it's a wonderful project that the bishop, who I have great admiration for, Bishop Scarf, has decided to allow donor designation. So an individual could make a pledge to the Gilead campaign and have the entire pledge go to their local congregation. Or they could do a tithe to the denominational campaign. So it's quite flexible. It's quite brilliant. I anticipate a tremendous success. We've got more than 600,000 in early gifts before we've even begun.
Good, good. Okay, so are we live now, Larry? For everybody?
Yes, they're loading. We got a couple more that just added in.
As you can see, we're just having a little chat beforehand, but I think we're ready to launch. And so here we go. So first of all, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for this half an hour, and we'll try and keep it right to the half hour because we know everybody's very busy. I'm Paul Alexander. I'm the new missioner for development and financial stewardship here in the diocese, and really excited to be able to launch this this series, and looking forward to your input about what we can do better and how we can improve things, and really looking forward to having an interactive time today. We really want you to put your questions out there and use as much as possible. We know some of the things we'll be doing today will be old hat for you, and it'll be like just good confirmation that that you're doing good work, and hopefully there'll be some new ideas that you can incorporate as well. So Tracy.
And I'm Tracy Methy. I'm the coordinator for development and stewardship here at the diocese, and I work closely with Paul. This series of webinars that we've developed was created based on input from you, the people who completed the development and stewardship survey about 6 weeks ago. So this is the type of information we've been told you would like to hear. So hope you enjoy.
So we're really pleased to have with us Dennis Green, who's going to be our main presenter and interactive person today. Dennis has over 30 years of experience in development and stewardship with churches all across the country and the world. Right now, his current model, he wrote a great book that we can get you if you'd like, and many of you that actually filled out the survey received his book, and a number of dioceses or a number of parishes around the church are using this method and as kind of a guiding force, including Good Shepherd and Centennial, and so I think they found it very helpful. Some of you may have heard he's also doing the capital campaign for the Diocese of Iowa. Very exciting project in which all the parishes across the state are doing capital campaigns together, and it's a really exciting project, something that we may try sometime here in Colorado. So he's got lots of experiences in stewardship and development, and also with the Episcopal Church. So before I hand it over to Dennis, I'd just like to ask if we could join in prayer, and then move forward that way. So let us pray. Most merciful God, we thank you for all the blessings of this life. Teach us to use our gifts wisely and in your service. Help us to remember that all we have is yours, and guide us as we seek to better serve you and live in right relationship with each other and with all your creation. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen. So Dennis, we'll pass it on to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to join you. It is a pleasure. I will never forget my first time attending worship services in Episcopalian Church the visiting bishop was a female, and when it was time for communion, we stood up to get in line, and I asked my wife, which line would you like to get in to receive communion? She says, I don't care what line you get in, but I will be receiving communion from her. And that was immediately endearing to both of our hearts at that moment. So it's a pleasure to be with you. I bring a whole ton of experience, many decades of experience. We've had a lot of successes, raising more than $200 million in church capital campaigns. But perhaps more importantly, we've had many failures as well. And we've kept track of the best practices that we found using capital campaigns as our test site for developing the concepts of stewardship. Stewardship is pretty important to me personally. I remember my introduction to stewardship came in 1979. I'd taken a 5-day float trip down the Congo River and ended up in Angolan war zone by mistake. And I was mistaken for a participant in the war, and I had a gun to my head. And that was the first time I actually prayed and meant it. I grew up a Catholic, and I went to a Baptist college, so I had multiple options. However, it seemed like neither a time for a Hail Mary or a Hallelujah at that moment. The prayer that came out of me was, Dear God, into your hands I commend my soul. And it was a fascinating discovery because I wasn't executed at that moment, needless to say. But I found that the prayer changed me. My internal motivation changed from being such a reprobate to actually thinking, how might I do God's will with my remaining time on earth? And that was the first time I ever had a selfless thought. That seed germinated and it flourished into serving the church in a stewardship role years later, after I continued to ruminate and pray on that. And what I've discovered, I read a lot about the subject, is people who are generous tend to have happier lives. In the book Give to Live, Gregory Lawson cited a research project in which he discovered that those who give more than 2% of their income to charitable causes have a higher level of T cell production in their immune system. That's a very objective assessment. Subjectively, he discovered that people who gave more than 2% of their income to charitable organizations, they reported having a closer relationship with God. We've got an objective measure and a subjective measure that makes me think perhaps I should consider myself being in service to people who are considering stewardship as part of their faith journey. So with that in mind, we've collected a lot of data on what works and what doesn't work to facilitate that mindset. Now, to make the most out of our time together, I would encourage you to write down your questions and click on that box and send it to us. In advance, Paul and Tracy have collected a whole sheet full of questions, as Tracy said, that have come from our survey in advance. All right, now on the next slide, you see, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take a brief overview of stewardship and what it looks like and how it works. We're going to talk about the bare minimum that I would encourage you to do to get a stewardship effort rolling in your church. We'll cover the 7 elements of the stewardship system, which we can give you for free. Paul offered a book. We also have a website with a whole lot of free resources you can download to implement these things in your church starting tomorrow. And we've even stratified them. What can you do if you have no money to spend? And what do you do if you have $1 to spend? Because virtually nobody has a big budget. So what we can do for free and what can we do for a modest expense? Then we'll conclude with next steps. Now, for us, stewardship nerds, we know that stewardship is a state of mind. It's a part of one's faith journey. It is a function of discipleship. And if we look at it that way, then we kind of shift it. And it reflects itself even in ways about what words we use to describe stewardship. I've learned that it's a bad idea to ever use the word tithing with a person under the age of 70. So stewardship is a better word, from maybe the age of 70 to the age of 50. And then younger than that is the term generosity. So that next generation, younger than me, they prefer to think of how might I share that which with I have been blessed? So I'd like you to think for a moment. How would you define stewardship? These are three responses I've gotten that are most frequently received when we ask that question. Now, moving ahead to beyond defining stewardship, most people do not tithe. Most people do not get the idea at all. The average member of an Episcopal church gives about 2.2% of their income, which is a lot better than the Catholics, who give 1.2, less than the Baptists, who give 2.4. Seventh-day Adventists and the Jewish folks all give about 7% of their income. The average church in the United States has about a 30% pledge participation and about the same level of volunteer participation. So this circular chart on the next slide, we've tried to look at the underlying causes of failure. You can see only half of all churches actually do an annual campaign. Only about 1 out of 5 have a stewardship committee. Less than 1% have a culture of stewardship in which they teach stewardship. Now, Tracy, as you have surveyed the members of your diocese, what do you think these numbers are in Episcopal churches in Colorado? What percent of your folks do you think conduct an annual campaign?
Oh, we've surveyed churches a couple of times. In our recent survey, it was probably about 85%. When we had,
that's wonderful.
Yeah, and it was much lower when we surveyed the entire church about 1.5 years ago when we had an outside organization come in and visit with parishes.
That was about
Okay.
60% or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the ones that are engaged in the survey were quite high, but overall it's about 60%. So fairly close, a little bit higher maybe than your 50%.
Okay, well, that's a very good sign. So, Paul, you're new to this job. To what degree do you hear the language of stewardship? What are those indicators that you see that reflect a culture of stewardship being embraced among those churches that you serve?
That's a good question. I think, for me, the churches that really have embraced this actually have quit using the word stewardship. It's really more of talking about discipleship or right relation or community. And I think once you hear those words that go beyond, fundraising or annual campaign or stewardship, and really begins to see this as embedded in the life of the church with those other words, that's when it really feels like, okay, this really has become a way of being and a spiritual journey.
So it's a rarity. When people embrace that language and the worldview, their whole life seems to change. I've got a question that popped up in the dialogue box, and let me just read it to you. What kind of language can encourage those who have given modestly, perhaps $100 a month, to shake up this habit to move towards generosity? The author of this question says, I can only come up with language that is scolding and negative. Well, at risk of putting myself at peril for an inappropriate quote, I remember serving a church where someone suggested we have as a motto for our annual campaign, give or go to hell. I have found that this does not work. Scolding, it never works out well. Now, I do have a 20-year longitudinal study of 100 churches that, in my opinion, selected the most effective method for shifting consciousness towards a discipleship mentality. And they used lay speakers once a month for 20 years. And they asked them 3 questions. Number 1, how has God blessed you? Number 2, how do God's blessings flow through you? And then number 3, how did my life change when I realized that's the life of a disciple? That's the life I want to give. So every one of those talks and all those 100 churches were radically different from each other. But they inspired the members of those churches to double their giving on a per capita percentage basis over that 20-year period. Now, certainly 20 years is a long time. It's not overnight. But it is an apple-to-apples correspondence. So percentage of per capita income doubled. So she asked that question, what can I do to shake them up? It's probably not your language. Lay speakers are going to be your most effective tool. Now, let me talk more about that when we walk through these 7 different parts of the stewardship system. Teaching the idea of stewardship is absolutely critical. Now, in this next slide, you see the absolute minimum that I would recommend you do immediately starting today. Have a stewardship committee. And you don't have to call it stewardship. You can call it generosity or engagement, whatever you would like. Don't call it fundraising, because it's not fundraising. Fundraising is a transactional relationship. Stewardship or generosity is we are a conduit for blessings. So at a minimum, please create a stewardship committee. Have a committee, even if it's just a committee of 1, because they can take these ideas and implement them tomorrow. And number 2, they can just take and download these free resources from the stewardship system. If you click on our website, you can just get this stuff for free. Take it, put it in your Sunday bulletin. It's got scripts for lay speakers. It's got many things you can do starting immediately that will increase people's understanding of stewardship and their embrace of that. Now, let me get very specific. And Paul and Tracy, I would welcome your participation. We're going to take 7 minutes to walk through these 7 things, and I would welcome you interrupting to add more detail to each of these. So the first of the 7 items is teaching stewardship. Now, let's go backwards 1 slide so we can cover. Here the 7 items are. Teaching stewardship, so they get the idea. Giftedness training, or another word for that is the proper management of volunteers. Community building, shared decision making, prayer and discernment, asking for support. You do have to ask, and then thanking people. Now, we can measure the impact of each one of these things statistically as well. Let's just take that very first one about teaching stewardship. The statistic that I told you a moment ago, teaching stewardship really seems to have the ability to double one's generosity over a course of time. Now, that first bullet you see, the green items are free. The non-green items might cost you a little bit of money. Lay speakers are free. We can send you a training video to equip them, but they are going to be your most effective speaker, more so even than a clergy member. Isn't that interesting? Bulletin inserts. Every single week there needs to be a paragraph that describes and teaches what is stewardship. And 0% ever asks for money. 100% is related to discerning God's will in my life and having the strength to act that out. We suggest that you have a monthly e-newsletter, and in that, a column about what is stewardship. We can give you the column. You can modify it as needed. We would like your clergy to give 4 sermons per year. Most clergy will not do that. There's a book I'd like to recommend. It's titled, Why Catholics Don't Give. Catholics Lead the Way in Giving the Least. And what the author discovered, Zek is the author's name, is that Catholics lead the way in their reluctance to talk about money in any form. So we know that you have to talk about it sometime. You have to educate people. Matter of fact, statistically, Jesus spoke about money a great deal. You can read that and look at the statistics. Now, a planned giving workshop, we think you ought to do that every single year. We can give you a free book about how to pull that off. We encourage you to have a personal finance Dave Ramsey kind of workshop every year. What we discover is those participants tend to triple their giving to their church. And we also think a financial coaching ministry using coaches from that instruction is very helpful.
Dennis,
right now,
I know you'll be talking later too about this, but I think just allowing that space for discussion in the parish, whether it's small groups or during adult hour discussion, just to really, we're reluctant to say let's talk about this, but to encourage every possible way to engage in our relationship with money and resources is a really is an important thing that we often are afraid or are hesitant to do.
You're right. So we want to shift it from being a hidden subject to be out in the open and people, and we always frame it spiritually. It's about discerning God's will. And if you take that approach, then it's I rest easy in that. As long as people indeed are praying and discerning, things always turn out well. Now, of each of these methods on the next slide, you've got my favorite, which is lay speakers. Start today, videotape them, get them on an iPhone, post them on your website. So when people go church shopping, they see a number of 3-minute little bitty videos that are spoken by someone similar to them that it gives a glimpse into one person's spiritual life. Okay, next slide. Now we're going to shift to the second, volunteer engagement. So how can we help volunteers discern their spiritual gifts? There are many free resources, and we encourage an annual volunteer fair to illuminate the many opportunities and to facilitate people's growth in their own self-awareness. What am I good at? What are my driving values? It really helps to expand that definition of vocation. So a workshop once a year in your church will increase your volunteerism. Now, statistically, we have discovered that this item right here is the magic bullet. The Fidelity Fund in 2009 did a study of donors and discovered that people who were active volunteers gave 11 times more than people who were not volunteers. So if that's all we knew about stewardship, what should we do tomorrow? Number one, go find ways to help people volunteer. Now, the green item, go ahead.
Well, I just, some of you know from this past weekend that we invited Mary Parmer from Invite, Welcome, Connect to the High Plains region to give a workshop. And one of the core elements of Invite, Welcome, Connect is exactly what Dennis is talking about, and connecting people to ministry based on their need to serve, but also just their individual gifts that they bring, and that those people, they're more likely to give, but they're also more likely to find a church home with you and to stay, not go out the back door, as Mary Parmer described it.
And that's really what we want. We want to invite them in because we're all seekers. The St. Augustine that said, my heart is restless until it rests in thee. We're all seekers. That's hardwired into us. And people can find a way to connect. Now, the bottom line on this slide, the green item, is on the next slide. You'll see my favorite thing is creating episodic volunteer opportunities. So Gallup Polling did this assessment instrument called the ME25, and they analyzed thousands of churches and discovered that at our core, we only have about 15% of our people who are comfortable with serving on a standing committee. And we've got a middle group of about half of our populations who are lukewarm, and then the outer 35% we might only see regularly. So we should not have a standard expectation that we're going to get somebody to serve on a standing committee. We have to create a thing called episodic volunteer opportunities. Think one and done. And I would encourage you to create something every single month. It'd be better if you could do it every single week, but a minimum of once a month. Put it in the bulletin. Give a time and a place, make it an hour-and-a-half long volunteer opportunity so they don't have to serve on a committee. They show up, they do something, and then they're done. We've discovered that's a conversion experience. So when we track our participation in our church capital campaigns, we want to design a process that loads up on short-term, easy, fun volunteer opportunities. And we know that if they're involved, they will own it and they will give more generously. And it tends to be a one-way valve. They tend to not go backwards after they've had that immersion experience of being part of something successful. So
and Dennis,
do it today, and it's free. Yes, Paul.
And I think the other thing, just to add to that, because I think this is really critical, is, you don't need to make up these ideas. Your parish, the parishioners have all they're volunteering and doing amazing things in the community, and get the ideas from them, and then they become the leaders in this, and then there's this collective group that happens. And so it's not something you need to struggle with. It's already there in your parish community, and you just need to tap that passion.
That's exactly right. You just need to be organized, understand the phenomenon, and make it happen. It's imminently doable, so do it today. Okay, on the next slide, we talk about the impact of connecting people socially. Now, the research from this tells us that social connection is almost like a binary switch. And the book that this is from is called Influence, and I'm racking my brain to remember the author, but the switch is, if I know the names of people who are involved in this, then I'm in. If I don't have a social connection with those people, I am out. So we want to find ways to connect people socially. Now this graph that you see, this pie chart here, is really a reflection of the Gallup polling statistics. There's another researcher named Matthew Kelly who thinks it's even worse than this. He thinks the blue slice is really only 6%. So we as stewardship facilitators have got to find ways to inexpensively connect people socially. Ideally, everybody would be involved in a small group, but that's hard to organize. It requires consistency. So what can we do today? In my opinion, the easiest, quickest thing we can do is to create an environment for mingling after worship services, have coffee and donuts. That's my favorite thing. Now, if you have got a social media outlet, you can assign a volunteer to have a constant stream of engaging people through social media. In the old days, when I was a kid, potluck dinners were a regular thing. Now they're not so frequent. I recommend going backwards in time and having a quarterly potluck dinner, because we want to connect people socially so they're in no pressure to interact. Now, on the next slide, you see pictures of my favorite food group, donuts of all their varieties. Coffee and donuts, that could be my diet. And this gives people, particularly of the male gender, an opportunity to interact, because we tend to be less skilled socially. It gives us an excuse to be in proximity to other humans. So at a minimum, we can ask, where's the creamer and where's the sugar?
Dennis, here in Colorado, it's beef or tofu.
Well, actually, my favorite is apple fritters, and I would bring my own. All right, on the next slide, involvement in decision-making. We've discovered if people own a decision, they will support it financially. I was introduced to this about 30 years ago when I observed a pastor in clerical garb at the end of worship services say, please stick around after worship. I'd like your input on something. And then you know how it goes after church. Half the people just run for the doors as if the building is on fire, but half the people stayed. And the senior warden brought in a flip chart and stood up there, and there was a microphone, and the pastor said, here's the question we're considering, and we just want to hear your input. If you'd like a microphone, we've got one. It's only going to take 15 minutes, so people lined up and shared their opinion. It literally took 15 minutes. At the end of it, the pastor said, thanks for your input. In 2 weeks, we'll let you know the impact of your input. It's going to go to this committee, and they will take your input in mind. It was wonderful. It was easy. It was quick, and people knew what was going on, and they had a sense of connection to that as well. Now, my next favorite thing is very inexpensive, and that's SurveyMonkey. Anybody here use SurveyMonkey? It's the best. Am I right?
Yep, that's what our survey was on.
It's free. It's thorough. Please do this 4 times a year. At a minimum, do a survey right before your annual campaign. Right before. 1 month before. And have the question, if we raise more money this year, as we do our budgeting looking ahead for the year ahead, what would you recommend that we spend that money on? So 2 things are happening there. You're getting their input, and then the second thing is they're imagining what would happen if we collectively gave more money. That is a wonderful exercise of the imagination, them imagining themselves giving more money. So this will cause them to stretch. Now remember, we are a servant to value. So you're really asking people to bring to the forefront of consciousness. Well, what are my driving values? What should we be doing? Then we report back on the survey, then we report back on the budgeting process, and people will see their input recorded in the budget. They will see it reflected in reality. Now, in the next slide, you see my favorite thing, which is town hall meeting. Do it today. Do it this Sunday. Please have 4 per year. Just pick them. It's not democracy. It's listening and engagement. Okay, the next subject, and we are moving towards our conclusion, prayer and discernment. So we really want to engage people in the thinking through of their decision about giving, and it should always be set in the context of discerning God's will in one's life. And we don't want to put pressure on. We don't want to exert anything. We don't want to go door to door that says you've got to give this amount. It is not a tax. We really just want to invite people into a closer relationship with God. So how can we do that? Your pastor can speak about it. It can be from the pulpit. It can be in small groups. It can be a season of discernment. It can be a survey of members on their spiritual needs. When we do a feasibility study in a capital campaign, that's usually our first question. How well are we doing meeting your spiritual needs? What else could we be doing to better meet your spiritual needs? Now, the teaching from the pulpit, the prayer activities, there are a variety of things you can do, but I have found out there's one thing that really is magnificent, and that is that bottom bullet, creating a prayer and discernment guide. And in that, we might have it be a 1-week discernment process or a 2-week discernment process, and we would have a different author each day sharing 3 paragraphs of their faith journey and how they discern God's will. Everybody, when they get that little prayer guide, they cheat and they read ahead. You're supposed to just read 1 a day, and they read ahead. And people love it because it's full of stories. It's stories about real human beings and God in their life. By far, this is my favorite to see in action and my favorite to read as well. Now, this is not in green because it takes a little bit of time and a little bit of effort, but you can do it. And I would encourage you to think about doing that this year, this fall, in your annual stewardship campaign. Okay, on our next slide, you have to ask. Now, we recommend 4 asks per year, not 52 asks per year. We recommend 4 different asks, your annual campaign. Have a capital ask. So it could be chuck holes in the parking lot, could be a light, could be a boiler or a roof. Some people just like to give. So I'm frequently reminded of Robert Greenleaf, who coined the term servant leader. A capital ask will lift people out of their moribund ways. It's the first time I ever used the word moribund in a sentence. But to lift us up out of our boring, same old way of looking at things. And this takes tremendous pressure off the annual budget if we can set aside those capital needs and have a special ask once per year. The 4th ask, I'll skip the 3rd one for a minute. The 4th ask is your year-end ask. Do this, please. A lot of times we will raise 10% of all the money that we raise in the year-end Christmas ask. You might only have a dozen donors to it, but usually they're very generous donors. And the final one, which, go ahead, pardon me?
I was just going to ask, this is a new way of doing things, at least for our parish, having multiple appeals. But I'm wondering, which of these do you think appeals most to the younger generations?
Well, that's really a good question. A long time ago, I was a member of the younger generation. And upon reflection, I realized supporting an annual campaign requires a certain level of spiritual maturity. So it tends to be your saints who support the annual campaign. Those of us, like me when I was a little bit younger, we needed something special and unusual. So these 3 alternates, other ways of asking, appeal to a younger generation. They are more likely to respond to an appeal that might say, we need to fix the roof. You can sponsor 1 square foot of the roof for $10, or 1 hole in the parking lot for $50, or one parking space where we're going to resurface the parking lot, or a window, or 1 key in a piano. Now, the visual, auditory, kinesthetic quality of that ask stimulates generosity. An emergency ask, so most people the subconscious only knows 2 times, either now or not now. An emergency ask says, it's now. So please jump in and do something this second. Now, leaping ahead to the generational issues in giving, the technology is really the key to generational giving. We have to facilitate their lack of cash. They're not carrying a checkbook. They've got a debit card, and they can text to give. So everybody needs to have text to give. I have a favorite company that delivers that. Its name's Vanco. It's not very expensive. They're very experienced. You need to have a text to give. On your website, you need to have a site that's secure for giving. And there's a new thing that's coming out that's just leading edge. It's called the dip jar. It's literally the size of a Coke can where you dip and can make a $20 gift in 3 seconds. They're having a little bit of technology problems, but I predict in the next year, this will flood the market. Because it's literally 3 seconds. You dip, and then a light says, bing, thank you, you've donated $20.
And we're going to be focusing on that in our third session too, which is, so if you're interested in technology and really doing these things, come back in 3 weeks or 2 weeks.
Right. Okay, yeah, come back in 3 weeks. We'll have much more depth about using technology. So your question, Tracy, was about appealing to the next generation. It's got to be right now. It's got to be something they can visualize, and it's got to be non-cash. And we've got to, this means it's work. Should we do it? Yes. The return on investment for annual campaign activities is $50 raised for every $1 spent. So it's a fantastic return on investment. So please do this. All right. In the next slide, this is a sophisticated subject, but a fantastic return on investment that seems to get a 6% increase in giving every year is creating a tailored pledge card. So my pledge card would say Dennis and Jenny Green, my address, how much I gave or pledged last year, and then a box in which I might just check. Increase my giving by 3%, 6%, 10%, or other. That tailored pledge card seems to have a dramatic impact. It's very labor intensive. It's going to take one staff person a whole day to make 200 of those pledge cards. Totally worth it. You put that with a personalized pledge card, the personalized pledge card with a personalized letter, personalized envelope, it seems to make an enormous difference. Okay, so we're almost out of time. Let's shift to our next one. This is our final item. And again, we have, you can ask us some questions. I've got a few more questions we have not answered yet. But the thanks process is a delicate one. You need to thank people. However, 15% of the people will be angry that they're being thanked. So you have to proceed very delicately. The best method is also the most inexpensive one. It is the handwritten note. And I encourage you to do this. Have a volunteer, have them sign their real name when they say, "Dear Mary and Joe, thank you so much for the support of our annual campaign. Sincerely, Dennis Green." And no one is going to know how much anybody else pledges. That's not the issue. Most people very much appreciate getting that handwritten note. If you're a clergy person listening right now and you have the time or would be willing to do that, that is a magnificent gift that you're giving people. As a matter of fact, you will get thank you notes back thanking you for the thank you note. It's an endearing circle. So please do that. Okay. My favorite one, this is an advanced topic. We do this in all our church capital campaigns. On the next slide, do a symbolic gift with a handwritten note. So write a note that says thank you. And the best circumstance is to have an anonymous volunteer, which is usually me when I'm working on a capital campaign. I usually make the donation to cover the cost of one of these, so that when people complain, the pastor can say, "I totally agree with you. Thank goodness we've got an anonymous donor who covered the cost." And as soon as they hear that, they say, "Oh, I like that Christmas tree ornament. May I have two?" And of course we say yes. Now, it's interesting, behavior there's a guy who got a Nobel Prize recently for writing the book, Thinking Fast and Slow. His name is Daniel Kahneman. He created the field of behavioral economics. And he discovered that our memories are kind of a bifurcation. There are these two bumps in memory. We remember the high point and we remember the most recent experience when we look at, for instance, giving to my church. So when I look in the rear view of my memory, what I will remember is, how did they treat me last year after I made a pledge? Did somebody write me a thank you note? Did somebody give me a gift, or was there radio silence? We think it's very important to thank people. So you may proceed based on doing the least expensive thing, and that is just fine. Do that. Okay, now we're about to wrap up, and let me, on the next slide, we've got, actually, Larry, if you go back up to top stewardship budget priorities, get a stewardship staff person, have a special event guide. Forgive me. Right after this, Larry, let's go down below questions to give stewardship a budget. Please devote a little bit of money to stewardship. Nonprofits devote 20% of their revenue back to their development effort. Churches do well to budget 2% for stewardship. You can see in the golden rectangle there, this is really the math of thinking about stewardship in your church. It really does have a magnificent return on investment. Now, I'm going to pause and I'm going to pull up this a couple of questions that we got. And Paul and Tracy, I would also welcome questions or other points we want to make sure that we cover. There's one in here I would like to pull out in particular. Is it better to ask for a specific dollar amount or a percentage? The research says by far it is better to ask for a percentage. So when you ask, we kick around 10% as the goal, but remember only 5% of the population actually does that. So it might actually hurt you to talk about tithing 10%. Probably more effective to think about the national Episcopalian average of 2.2%. You could ask a person to increase their giving by 10%. Or another way to ask is ask a person to examine what percent of your income do you give to the church today. Please consider taking that up one more percentage of your income. So if you're giving 2% to the church today, consider giving 3% in the year ahead. By far, the percentage ask is the most effective and least offensive one. All right, other questions? So we need to make sure. The most effective, to summarize, I've got a really good question. How do we change the culture? By far, the most effective way is having lay speakers to talk about how has God blessed me and how am I a conduit for God's blessing. That is the number one most effective way of doing stewardship education. Now, we're a little bit over our time, but I want to respect Tracy and Paul. What other items do we need to cover before we break?
Okay. Okay. Well, I wanted to mention to everybody that this is a 4-week series on stewardship. So next week we will meet again at this time at noon on Thursday. And our topic will be giving as a spiritual practice. We've got 2 clergy from around the state who are participating at this point. We're hoping to have a third. If one of you out there is interested, let me know. We're always reachable at our first name, plus episcopalcolorado.org. If you need support of any kind, a conversation, if you need to brainstorm, if you're looking for resources, feel free to contact us by email or phone here at the diocese. Dennis mentioned the subscription that's free to the stewardship system, right? And I would encourage you to take advantage of the resources. It can save you a ton of time by providing just wording, boilerplates, things like that. We also have resources on our episcopalcolorado.org website that can be found under congregational resources. So take time to check those out as well.
Yeah, and please don't hesitate. We know this was just a taste. Dennis is an amazing resource, and that's what we're trying to be here. So any questions, as Tracy said, just email us, call us, stop in. Dennis even has family here in Colorado, and we might be able to corral him for a lunch occasionally to get your questions answered. So thanks so much for joining us today. Dennis, any last words that you have? We really appreciate this, and we know we went over a little bit of time, but we hope it was a useful time together. Dennis?
Thank you so much for inviting me, Paul and Tracy. Yes, my one word is please try something. Try one thing. Try one single thing that you heard today, and I guarantee it's going to work. Everything that we do has an incremental impact. So try one thing today and see what works. Then maybe a month or two from now, you can try a second thing. But in conclusion, I would say, go forth, good luck, and God bless.
Well, thank you. And I wanted to say one more thing, and that is that this was recorded today. So if you have stewardship committee members or vestry folks who would like to watch this, it will be available on the Church Development YouTube channel, as well as our YouTube channel. And I will make sure that I email out all the participants that information either today or tomorrow. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Great.
Have a good day. Bye.
You bet. Bye-bye.